And one common bond that ties all those companies together right now is everybody wants to know what they're doing with AI.
Exactly. It's the big new thing. And you remember, Maureen, the last big new thing in tech was actually the metaverse, you recall. In fact, it was so big, they named a company after it. So we went to that company and we talked to Sir Nicholas Clegg. He's Meta President of Global Affairs. And we talked to him about exactly how the metaverse fits with what's going on with AI. And by the way, what should the government be doing about it all?
It's sometimes difficult, isn't it, to work out whether it's going to be great or whether it's going to be bad for us, because, I mean, I've been working in Silicon Valley for some years now, and of course Silicon Valley generates the most ingenious new technologies, but usually accompanying those new technologies is a whole wave of new hype as well. And of course, you know, technologists are saying on the one hand that generative AI is going to cure cancer and deal with climate change, and on the other hand, it's going to be the end of civilization as we know it. I think the truth is that no one really knows, and that actually whether this technology is good rather than bad is in large part in our hands. In large part, it depends on the cooperation, both of folk in the industry, but also cooperation by governments across the world to set an international framework which really amplifies the good that these very powerful technologies can deliver, and they can deliver great benefits of productivity, for health, for education. It's going to be hugely useful for many people in many walks of life, but also to mitigate the dangers and the risks. Because look, at the end of the day, AI is bigger than any single company or any single industry or indeed any single country. So both the big tech players and the big, I think, most especially the big techno-democracies around the world, the United States, the European Union, India, and so on, need to cooperate together and do so fast to start to set the international framework that will be necessary in the years ahead.
Governments typically are tasked with the job of making sure that we get the good without the bad. You know a lot about regulation, particularly in the tech area. What are the things we should be looking at, all of us should be looking at, in terms of government role in regulating AI?
Governments themselves need to set up the right kind of processes and institutions to avoid a kind of race where, you know, Europe does one thing, the US does something else, India does something else, Brazil and Japan do their own thing. I think that kind of regulatory fragmentation, which has in many respects occurred in existing regulation of online services, would be a really self-defeating development. And that's why I am hopeful, and I certainly would hope, that the big techno-democracies, the US, Europe and India, could come together, initiate some work, start seeing whether they can converge on some basic tramlines of what is and what is not acceptable in the development of these very powerful new technologies. China, of course, has already rushed to institute its own rules, but those rules are based on very different values. Just last week, it was reported that the Chinese have said that all generative AI developed by companies in China must not do anything to offend the state, must enshrine the values of Chinese socialism and so on. But that's clearly not the kind of approach we want to take in the West. And I think, incidentally, Japan could play an outsized role here, not just because it is such a technologically advanced economy and a democracy as well, but because at the moment Japan holds the chair of the G7. And in fact, in the coming days, digital ministers from the G7 economies will be meeting. I think it's exactly the kind of forum where you can initiate work so that the big major techno-democracies around the world can converge on similar guardrails which can be applied to these very powerful new systems.
So, Nick, I wonder if we're seeing a real-life lesson right now playing out in Washington about the attempts to regulate technology with respect to TikTok. You saw those hearings up on Capitol Hill. Some people, Republicans and Democrats, are saying we should just ban it. Are there things to learn from what we're seeing there? Is it a sensible thing to go forward? You said we shouldn't regulate technology itself, but are there things we should learn from what we're looking at TikTok and what should be done?
Look, not least because TikTok is a competitor of Meta. I'm not going to try and sort of weigh into this, and the national security considerations which have been debated in DC are really for national security folk and for the administration to decide upon. I think, as a general principle, it's always good in any market, including the sort of technology market, to have a level playing field. And so, for instance, TikTok, which is a hugely successful, highly dynamic and innovative Chinese companies able to operate in the United States, but companies like Meta are not able to operate our social media services in China. So there is this issue of a kind of lack of a level playing field. And in the end, there's always an underlying issue of values. What values are the underpinning of new technologies. And you can see in the debate around generative AI that the Chinese authorities are already rushing to insert their values in the way in which those AI systems are developed. In the same way, by the way, that over the last 15 years or so, China has completely more or less sealed off the internet in China from the rest of the world and not pursue the way in which you and I might use the internet, the kind of open internet in which people can, there's a free flow of information across borders around the world. China has already taken a very different path and wants to pursue a very different path based on very different values, where issues of, individual data, privacy and so on simply don't loom as large in China as they do in the United States, North America, Europe, and so on. And so I think there is always an underlying debate, about whether there is a level playing field and people are competing with each other on the same terms, but also about these pretty profound differences in values. And I very much hope that, which is why I stressed earlier that I think it's so important that Europe, America and India, they don't need to act in the identical fashion. But if they can align, then we can ensure that these new technologies are based on democratic values and not on autocratic values. Because I can guarantee you, these very powerful new technologies are going to be used by autocrats around the world for their own purposes. And I think we need to do something quite different.